All right, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're digging into the deep-seated divides in Manipur, not just by looking at its geography, but by doing something really crucial. We're going to follow the money. Okay, so here's how we're going to break this all down. First, we'll get a feel for the land itself, the contrasts. Then we'll talk about the people who live there. After that, we dive into the real heart of the matter, the state's budget, what that looks like on the ground, and finally, we'll explore some ideas for the path forward. To really get what's happening in Manipur, the first thing you have to do is look at a map. Because the geography here, well, it's not just some pretty scenery. It literally sets the stage for this whole story of two very, very different regions. And this slide just lays it out perfectly. You've got this tale of two regions. On one side, you have the hills, making up a whopping 90% of the state's land, but they're really sparsely populated. And then you've got the valley, this tiny 10% slice of land that is absolutely packed with people. I mean, we're talking over 12 times the population density. This single fact is so important for understanding everything else we're about to talk about. So it's not just about the land, right? This physical divide. It's also a human one. Over time, different communities settled in these very distinct zones, and that's created cultural landscapes that are just as divided as the mountains and valleys. So who lives where? Well, the hill areas have historically been home to communities like the Kuki and the Tengkul Naga. On the flip side, the valley is mainly home to the Métis community. And these patterns go way back, partly because of British colonial policies that, for their own administrative reasons, kind of kept these regions and communities separate. Okay, so maps and history give us part of the picture. But if you really want to understand the tensions and the inequality we see today, you've got to do what we always say, follow the money. So the first thing you need to know is where Manipur's money even comes from. And honestly, this is pretty wild. A massive 90% of the state's revenue is projected to come from the central government. Only about 10% is generated by the state itself. That level of dependency is key. Which brings us to the million-dollar question, or in this case, the multi-crore rupee question. If almost all the cash is coming from the central government, how is it getting divvied up between the hills and the valley? Well, take a look at this. The difference in funding is just staggering. Between 2017 and 2020, districts in the valley got over 21,000 crore rupees. And in that same exact period, the hill districts, they got just 419 crore. It's a huge difference. I mean, just let that sink in for a second. We're not talking about a small difference here. The valley, which is just a tenth of the landmass, received 50 times more funding than the hills, which make up the other 90%. This isn't a gap, it's a financial chasm, and it tells you almost everything you need to know about why development has been so lopsided. And when you look at the state's overall spending plans, you see these big categories, right? Rural development, education. But the real story, the thing that actually matters, is where that money is landing geographically. And as we just saw, the historical trend is, well, it's pretty darn one-sided. Okay, so what does this massive financial imbalance actually look like in the real world? What happens on the ground when one area gets 50 times more funding than another? Well, it's not a huge surprise, right? It leads to what our sources call disproportionate infrastructure development. Basically, all that progress, the new roads, the schools, the economic growth, it's largely been concentrated in the valley. That's where you find the key institutions and economic hubs, which in turn attracts even more investment. It becomes a cycle. Now, to be clear, this doesn't mean there is absolutely nothing happening in the hills. The sources do point out some significant infrastructure projects trying to improve things. You've got new roads and bridges, and the Noni Bridge, which is this massive project set to be the tallest girder railway bridge in the world. So there are definitely things happening. But even with these new projects in the pipeline, this quote from our source material really just hits the nail on the head. It perfectly sums up the long-term result of that budget imbalance. For years and years, the scales of development and progress have just been tipped heavily in one direction. So you've got these huge, complex problems baked in by geography, history, and of course, finance. What can actually be done about it? Well, people are floating some really interesting and creative solutions to try and bridge this divide. One idea is all about people. It's about building bridges, but in a human way. The concept is to have young professionals from one community, say from the valley, go and work on real grassroots projects in the hills, and vice versa.
And the whole point isn't to take over, but to work together to build trust and understanding in critical areas like health and education.
But, building personal trust is one thing. To really solve the core conflict over resources, you have to tackle the biggest, most sensitive issue of all, land. And this next idea could be a real game changer. So here's the proposal, a 3-tiered system for land rights. Think of it like this. First, you have surface rights. That's your house, your farm, your personal space. Pretty straightforward. Second, resource rights for things like forests and minerals would be managed jointly by the state and a tribal committee. And third, and this is really clever, development rights could be given out temporarily for projects like roads or hospitals. That allows progress without forcing communities to permanently sell their land. And how do you manage a system that complex? Well, technology could be the answer. Imagine digital land record cards, kind of like a title deed for the 21st century. It would spell out exactly who owns which specific right, surface, resource, or development for any piece of land. It's all about bringing in transparency and cutting down on all those disputes. Ultimately, all of this leaves us with one final big question. You have this massive divide in Manipur, one that was carved out by mountains and valleys, reinforced by history, and then basically set in stone by decades of budgets. So can these new ideas, both the social ones and the big structural ones, actually start to bridge that gap? That's really the question for Manipur's future.